Hi, welcome to Faithful Politics. This is one of your co-hosts, Josh Bertram, the great, the magnificent,
the humble,
the humblest man on earth. And didn't Moses wrote that about himself? Maybe
he did.
Tremper Longman, the Old Testament scholar with us today, will correct me on that potentially. But Moses wrote it, so I guess I can say it.
Well, it's Numbers 12, verse 4. It's a famous, it's called an Mosaica, for even those who affirm Mosaic authorship agree that Moses probably didn't write that. That was
shoot.
I probably kind of goes crazy.
Now I can't do it.
It's like Moses is a humble man. There was no one more humble than Moses. It kind of goes on and on.
I mean, I was really hoping that could help me do, like, Josh Bertram is just a handsome, amazing person. And it was just like and I could just go on, and it was just like a great way that I could have a proof text for just being narcissistic. I really was hoping that was the case, but I guess it's not. And I mean, we're super excited today. I have my always amazing and dry humor ish Will. Hi, Will.
The driest. Hey,
the driest of dry. Bone dry, some say. And then we have, of course, we are in our March for Life series, which this entire month of March, we're going to go through several key issues that have to do with life. We're going to talk about abortion. We're going to talk about the death penalty for 2 weeks, one from a more spiritual perspective and another from a more legal perspective. And then we're going to talk about wars and assassinations. But today we're going to talk about abortions. And we have my good friend, Professor Tremper Longman. I say good friend. We're acquaintances, but I would hope that Tremper would think I'm one of his best friends. But he doesn't have to say that today because we've only really talked a few times. But I appreciate it so much for Tremper to be on with us. And he's a professor, distinguished scholar of biblical studies. And he currently teaches at Westmont. And with a specialization in Old Testament, he's wrote more books than than the Apostle Paul. He's definitely wrote more books than Moses, and he is just an absolute top-notch scholar in his area. And last time we had you on here, Tremper, we talked about just your book, The Bible and the Ballot, and we're actually going to take a deeper dive into the abortion chapter on that in that book. But thanks so much for being with us today.
Hey, thank you, Josh. Good to see you, Will. And yes, we are friends, and I'm glad to call you friends. And thank you very much for having me on. The only correction to my introduction is I am Distinguished Scholar and Professor Emeritus at Westmont, but I no longer teach full-time there. I teach a lot, and I'm on the board of trustees of Westmont, so I love Westmont College. For those of you who are looking for a Christian college to consider, especially in beautiful Santa Barbara, California. But I retired so we could move closer to our kids and grandkids. So I live in Alexandria, Virginia, just across the river from D.C.
Yeah, so close to us. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, thanks for that correction. That's good to know. But that association with Westmont you have there, and I should check out Westmont.
Yeah, I should also say that if you're watching this instead of listening to it on a podcast, the reason that you're not seeing Tremper's face is just connectivity issues. So I can promise you that he is actually the man behind the voice. There he is. So,
hello.
But we didn't want to sacrifice audio quality, over video, just because we really think that he's got a lot of really great stuff to say.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for pointing that out, Will. So we're going to just dive into some conversation today. And I know, Will, you had a question that you wanted to get us like jumping into the topic, but I wanted to before we do that, I just wanted to ask you, Tremper, what was it like for you to write this chapter on abortion? What you had mentioned before as the most controversial one you thought in the book. What was that experience like? Was it, sackcloth and ashes, fear and trembling, or was it more? What do you think? Those are very pastor jokes, so I apologize to everyone who's listening who isn't a Christian. Like, what are you talking about? Just me being at the work. So anyway,
Yeah. Well, yeah, maybe just briefly too, writing the book. Writing the book on basically the Bible and public policy issues related to politics is a little bit of both fear and trembling and sackcloth and ashes. And also was idea that one of my publishers, Erdman's, asked me to consider. And after a while, I realized that, the Bible does speak to issues related to public policy, not giving us specific public policy, but giving us principles to think through as we think about issues like abortion, religious liberty, criminal justice, environment. I deal with 10 different issues there. And then as I got into it more, it was not just principles, but also sort of attitudes that the Bible wants us to have toward different ideas. And also it informs the way we talk about those issues. The latter part struck me as I heard Christians and people who represent Christians saying some pretty ugly things, say, about immigrants. So we might be able to debate certain specific public policy issues concerning immigration, but there's no room to discuss the evil of derogatory speech and demeaning speech about immigrants. Now, when it comes to abortion in particular, I know this is a hot button issue. It's been a kind of cultural war issue, not since Roe versus Wade, but after that, it was kind of it became a real kind of hot button litmus test issue, and I obviously I wanted to be honest with the text as I was reading it and not approach the text with preformed ideas, though I had some ideas that I wanted to hold loosely when I went into it, and I found my views on abortion not change from a pro-life to a pro-choice viewpoint, but I saw my viewpoint or my understanding what the Bible teaching as not completely affirming all the rhetoric that you hear in the pro-life evangelical camp. And it begins, another thing that I should begin with as I got into this text is there is no biblical text or passage that speaks directly to the issue of abortion. There is no, as one might expect, law in the Pentateuch that directly forbids abortion. We might get into a little bit later pivotal passage in Exodus 21, which itself is somewhat ambiguous about as it applies to the issue of abortion. So I guess that's some preliminary comments about it, Will.
Yeah, and my own personal kind of journey with abortion has changed over the years. I wasn't necessarily born into a Christian family per se, and I gave my life to Christ actually at the literal altar when I got married. You know, before, I guess in the before times, I was very pro-choice because it was almost like a libertarian sort of standpoint. I just didn't really care what people did with their bodies. And then when I put on the Christian hat, it's almost like you give your life to Christ, and then like you have people give you tracts about all the things you're supposed to believe and not believe, and one of them was like, yeah, you're supposed to automatically hate abortion and hate anybody that's for abortion, and I'm like, what, like I'm not ready for this, so as I kind of struggled with, my own personal connection or stance on abortion, it was always grounded somewhat on my understanding of where life began. And I know that in your book, I don't think, even just through the passages, that there's a lot of different references of where, or maybe a lot of different interpretations of where life began. But, my own personal interpretation is at the point of conception. And the way I kind of rationalize that is, if if a sperm, goes into an egg, and I'm probably not getting the biology or science right, but like at the point where there's a viability of a life to be born, and that cell, even if it's a clump of cells, was found on like Mars, we'd be sending every single rocket up there to go check it out. So I've always kind of taken sort of the standpoint of, okay, like once like life begins or has the potential to be life, then that's kind of where my view on abortion stands. But I know not everybody takes on that same sort of viewpoint. So I'd be curious to kind of get your take about, where life begins, and, if there are any sort of like scriptural texts that, that can back that up.
Yeah, I mean, it is not a question where you can go to a particular text and say, see, this is where life begins. Indeed, we and if you say it begins with conception, you have to also take the viewpoint that, well, at least like birth pills are illegitimate, which is the Catholic view, because of the fact that doesn't prevent all the time a sperm uniting with an egg. I think they call it a zygote, and implanting itself on the uterine wall. So the question to me, I mean, as I read about it, I think what we should say with some certainty is that once that happens, there's a potential of life there, right? And even the potential of life has moral worth, okay? But then the question becomes, does that mean taking the pill or having a very early term abortion, is that the moral equivalent to shooting a 10-year-old in the head? A horrible thought, but are they the moral equivalent? And that's the rhetoric that some pro-life people use, suggests that, that all abortions, no matter when it happens, is the moral equivalent to murder. And I'm not convinced that you can make that case from the Bible, particularly when we come to a passage like Exodus 21, which we can talk about in a moment, even though there's ambiguity there and a lot of disagreement there about how to interpret it. So I think that's the question to me. And of course, there's a lot writing on that question, not just on the side of protecting the unborn child, but on the side too of, if you press the idea that say, an early term abortion. And again, if it's a potential life, then that potential gets more actual as we move through the pregnancy, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
But if you on the other side, if you keep arguing that even from conception, then that opens up a tremendous demonization of, say, a woman who takes the pill or who gets an early term abortion. She's a murderer, basically, or complicit in murder. And my worry about that is not all abortions are done for frivolous reasons. Some are, but many women are in deep distress and struggle, and I don't think it's our job to demonize them. Even if we recognize it as a moral violation, it's to come alongside of them and try to support them and maybe change their mind and persuade them. So I think that's how I came to be thinking about it. Now, getting back to the Bible real quickly, the question is, what defines human life? When does life begin, in the sense of when does so basically, so Catholics think, many Catholics and some Protestants have a view that what makes humans different than, say, other animals is that we have some kind of soul, intangible part of us. And so the question for them becomes, when does a human being have a soul? I think that's the wrong way to go anyway, because I think that's not supported by the scripture. That is that kind of dichotomous way of thinking about a human being. But what I rather think should be at the forefront of our mind is something that's not attribute or some sort of aspect of who we are, but rather a status that is image of God, and that is something that is conferred by the will of God. So I'm not sure Scripture is clear that right from conception, human beings have the status of image of God, representing God. Now, I'm talking a lot here rather than waiting for questions, but I'm anticipating questions. I mean, there's some passages.
No, keep going.
It's like in Psalm 139 or in Jeremiah 1, where it talks about, you say Jeremiah 1, Jeremiah says, well, I'll read it to you if you just give me a second to get there, because I can paraphrase it, but I'll probably butcher it a little bit. If I do that.
I have it in front of me. Do you want me to read it?
Sure, that'd be great.
So this is in the NIV, and it says, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations." That's Jeremiah 1:5.
Yeah. And I think some people want to look at that and say, well, that clinches it. I would rather suggest in this part of Jeremiah, it's a hyperbolic statement and not confirming the idea that that the child in the womb has the moral equivalent of a birthed child. Again, remember, my viewpoint is that the potential of life also has moral worth. But this is a way of basically saying, that God did know that Jeremiah was going to be born, and he did know he was going to use Jeremiah in this way. So I guess if you go to Psalm, there are a couple places where I would go to show that we got to be a little bit careful about the use of hyperbole in poetry. And Psalm 51.
So, Tremper, real quick,
Yeah.
Tremper, so I want to jump into these scriptures, but I just help us understand what like hyperbole is.
Oh, sure.
And like as and how to use it in interpretation, like what hyperbole is and how to use it in interpretation. So and even like as you're doing it, like corresponding, like what are the parts of hyperbole that correspond to reality? Like how does hyperbole help us understand the message and reality as best you can? Because I think when you say hyperbolic, people have a lot of different ideas, like exaggeration, but it's not quite exaggerate. Like what are we talking about here when we're talking about hyperbole in use in these poetic and prophetic sections?
Yeah. Right. Actually, I would start with the term exaggeration. It's an exaggeration for a rhetorical effect. That is, let me give you an example from sort of everyday life. And I talk at length, by the way, about hyperbole in another book that I wrote with John Walton called The Lost World of the Flood, because we both see in the flood narrative an extensive use of hyperbole, as well as, say, in the conquest narratives in Joshua 1 through 12, there's really obvious hyperbole. And those are in prose sections, but let me use an example that I use there from kind of everyday life. So when I travel with my wife, we haven't done so in about a year because of COVID, but she'll often look or maybe even try to pick up my suitcase and she'll say, "Honey, your suitcase weighs a ton." And so I recognize that immediately as hyperbole, right? I don't respond by saying, "Honey, nowhere near 2,000 pounds." But the connection with reality is my suitcase is full of books. So it's really heavy and it's heavier than her.
Right.
Okay. So there is definitely a connection to reality. And the connection to reality in Jeremiah 1 is that God, through his foreknowledge, knew that Jeremiah would be born and would be set aside for this purpose. And I think you get hyperbole in Psalm 51, verse 5, where David says, "Surely I was sinful at birth, sinful from the time my mother conceived me." Okay, so I know that there are theories of original sin, but based on this passage, which I think are quite wrong, and there are other, I affirm original sin, but I think it's a misuse of this passage to say, you know what, David was even sinful the very second the sperm hit the egg and implanted itself on the zygote. It's a matter of hyperbole. He was sinful from the very beginning. And then another passage I might take us to, let's see here, in Genesis 25. Let's see here. Yeah, so this is, this passage interested me because one of the arguments that Randy Alcorn, and I like a lot of Randy Alcorn's writing, so don't hear me dismissing Randy Alcorn, and he's definitely worth reading. In my opinion, he gets a little hyperventilated on this particular issue and takes things to an extreme. So, for instance, he argues that Christians should never use contraceptives for the reason I was talking about earlier. He said, well, notice that when Jacob and Esau are born, they are described as babies jostling within her womb in verse 22. And that's true. They're babies, right? But he doesn't cite verse 23, which says 2 nations are in your womb. Okay. So the point being that yes, they're the potential of children. They are also the potential of future nations, that they will be the father figures of 2 nations. So I guess what I'm saying is we have to be a little careful as to how we use certain scripture passages to support our view. And again, let me reiterate, this doesn't lead to a pro-choice perspective. It's just suggesting that there is a gradation of moral violation. And by the way, I think, let me give you another reason why I think this is really important. And let me take you back, 30 years, where I'm a teacher at Westminster Theological Seminary, maybe even almost 35 years ago, and back then, this evangelical stance against abortion was much more militant. I think, unfortunately, and one of the reasons I think it's important for us to talk about it is I think it's becoming militant again, fueled by the idea that all abortions are murder, led some, including one of my students, more than one of my students, but to adopt aggressive to the point of physically violent action against abortion clinics. And one of my former students advocated online the assassination / murder of abortion doctors. And so you see, our rhetoric can lead to really problematic behavior. And today, where I see it, and I understand the logic, but I don't agree with it, that if abortion is murder, then that justifies using abortion as, say, a single issue political, a political single issue. I will never vote for somebody who is, pro-choice. I don't care what they say about race. I don't care what they say about immigration. I don't care what they say about X, Y, and Z. But I will also, and I can see how that's motivated by the idea that these are the most vulnerable. But you're compromising on other issues like poverty support or whatever. So that's another thing that I think.
It's almost like I'd love to do like a whole podcast about like the weaponization of Christianity, because I think that you touch on a lot of great points, which you also do in your book as well. But as the only non-biblical scholar on the line here, I do have a question about why the Bible doesn't speak clearly about the topic of abortion, because I mean, if I recall, like, didn't the Romans like leave babies on the side of the road or something like that they didn't want? But I don't know where I get this from. Maybe it's just too much, I don't know, YouTube or something. But I recall something like that.
It goes back to even before the Romans. I think it's in particular the Spartans who are known for that practice. Even though we love the Spartans over against the Persians, the Spartans were, when we think of, modern movies and so forth. But there were also, widespread use of abortion drugs, ancient abortion drugs, and also primitive abortion techniques and so forth. So abortion was practiced in antiquity, both during the New Testament time period and during the Old Testament time period. So there, so there's some people, and I cite Meredith Kline, another Old Testament scholar I have a great deal of respect for, but disagree with him on this particular matter, who simply says abortion's not mentioned in the Old Testament law because there was no need. No Israelite woman would ever have gotten an abortion. I'm going, wait a minute, we have laws against necromancy and, and so many other wicked
sacrifice,
child sacrifice and things like that. So now, on the other hand, you could argue that you must not murder would be taken. The sixth commandment would be taken by everybody back then to imply the inclusion of unborn children. I'm not convinced of that, though, myself, partly because of my understanding of Exodus 21. And maybe we should go to Exodus 21 to talk a little bit
let's
about
go there. Let me read it.
Yeah.
Let me read it for us. And it's Exodus 21 and it's verse 22 and through 25, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so
that sounds right.
I'll read it for everybody. If people are fighting and hit a pregnant woman, this is the NIV, and as we'll see, there's different translations. But if people are fighting and hit a pregnant woman and she gives birth prematurely, that's the big one, right? And it puts a little thing there that says, or she has a miscarriage. It puts a little footnote in the NIV.
Right.
So if she gives birth prematurely, but there's no serious injury, the offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands and the court allows. But if there is serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. So what in the world is going on there, Professor? What's happening?
Yeah.
Are we supposed to cut each other's hands off?
Well, first of all, getting to the so-called Lex Talionis first, it's very clear from the penalties you actually see in the law themselves that this was not understood literally. It's talking about equivalent punishment to the crime. So it's saying, well, you go back to Genesis 4 and Lamech talks about a young man bruised me, so I murdered him. That's tribal justice back in the day, and that's kind of like that's what this is speaking against. No. You don't kill somebody for bruising you, bruise for bruise. And so I think we should, it's talking their language, but I think that that there's I hate bringing this up because there is one place where there is a sort of a physical maiming I don't remember exactly where it is, but where when a man grabs and crushes when a woman grabs and crushes a man's testicles, it says you're supposed to cut off his hand. And that's a, like this would get us into the question of how's the case law functioning anyway? And what I think is really clear is God is taking people where they are and moving them toward what I call the creation ideal or the Edenic ideal. It's not the case law does not legislate that, but that's a whole nother issue. But getting back to Exodus 21, the real crux is what the NIV translated and you read as gives birth prematurely, but also gives the alternate has a miscarriage. And of course, those two have radically different implications for the issue of abortion, right? So
yes,
let me begin.
And different translations translated differently.
Yes. Yeah. So the NRSV would translate it has a miscarriage. The Hebrew simply says, and the fetus or the child comes out. It doesn't specify whether the child comes out dead or alive. It just says the child comes out. Now, I am a Bible translator, and I know how these discussions go. And I specifically remember so let's remember that all translations are interpretations. All translations are interpretations. Some people want to criticize a translation by saying, oh, it's interpretive. Well, all translations are interpretation. I had this discussion with one of the lead translators of the ESV, which prides itself on being more word for word. And when he was accusing the NIV and the NLT,
better, of course.
Yeah. Well, he was accusing the NLT and NIV of being interpretive, and I said, you know that all translations are interpretation. I'll bet there are even parts of it you don't like. And then he proceeded to tell me what they are. I won't mention his name. I don't think he would be upset if I did, but let's just say he's one of the
Give us all the scholarly, juicy gossip, scholarly drama. That's what that's what our listeners really want to hear.
So you know, the NIV, the ESV, the NLT, they're all evangelical translations, all serving a theological community that is very pro-life, and of course we translators are also pro-life. So that it's the modern discussion that sways in that direction. On the other hand, the NRSV community is less sort of consistently pro-life, shall we say, and more open to abortion. So they translate miscarriage. Now, if I'm asking myself one or the other, I mean, the scenario is two people are fighting and they hit a pregnant woman. It's going to be more often the case that the child comes out dead than alive. Okay, so there's an argument to be made for miscarriage, but it's not so certain that you would want to use this as a proof text either way, is the point. But what I do find incredibly interesting and is how the Septuagint renders this verse. And you might ask, well, how is that relevant? The Septuagint is a Greek translation.
What is the Septuagint?
Yes, it's yep. Thank you.
Gotcha.
No, I'm going to explain it even more than I was going to, Josh, because you asked me that. The Septuagint is a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, done mainly in the 2nd century BC. Here's the significance of it. The significance of it is it's the Bible of Jews and early Christians. They didn't, unless you were a scholar, you did not read the Hebrew Old Testament. Why? Because Hebrew is a dead language by this time. No one is speaking Hebrew on the street. They're speaking Aramaic, they're speaking Greek, but they're not speaking Hebrew. Hebrew is kind of like At the time of Jesus in the early church, Hebrew is like Latin in the Middle Ages. Used to be a live language, now a dead language. So Jews, like Jesus and like the early disciples, the Septuagint was their go-to version. And what's interesting is that the Septuagint, being a translation, is also interpretive, and it interprets it in an interesting way. It says, if two men fight and they strike a woman who's pregnant and her child comes out while not yet fully formed, he will be forced to pay a fine. Whatever the woman's husband imposes, he will pay with a valuation. But if it is fully formed, he will give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, etc. The point being that the Septuagint rendition, which again was the go-to Bible at the time of Jesus, had this concept of what I'm calling growing potential of life. So if early in the pregnancy, fine. If later in the pregnancy, then we're talking very close, if not murder. And this is supported by two of the most prominent first century Jewish thinkers, Josephus and Philo, who take this approach as well.
Tremper, I have a question. You made a comment that I never really thought of before, where you are basically equating, people's stances on the abortion issue based on interpretations of the Bible. Am I getting that right?
Or I guess the kind of, maybe if I'm thinking of what you're referring to, it's more like their views on the abortion will affect how they translate Exodus 21.
Oh, I gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if you think abortion's wrong, then you're more apt to translate the child or Yeled will come out as was born prematurely. And again, I'm not saying that's obviously wrong. I'm just saying I don't think you can derive it from that passage itself.
But even that has like greater implications based on, if you got somebody that only reads from, one version of the Bible, then that that interpretation of that scripture and all the scriptures that are closely related would probably influence your Christian outlook on abortion, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and that's why if you dive into, and this is true of any issue, not just this issue, if you really want to get serious about studying a topic, and you want to explore on your own, don't restrict yourself to one translation, but rather read a bunch of different translations. Dive in, look at the commentaries where you see a difference of opinion, see what's going on behind it. Sometimes that will just engender a kind of healthy ambiguity, or at least, the Bible, as the reformers said, the Bible is really clear on what's important for salvation. But the reformers, and I'm thinking here of the Westminster Confession of Faith, kind of a post-Reformation Reformed confession, acknowledges that there's lots in the Bible that's not going to be crystal clear. And when you recognize that at least allows you to enter into a dialogue with somebody as you try to work out your own view. The Westminster Confession of Faith begins its statement on the clarity of Scripture by saying, not all Scripture is alike clear unto itself, but those matters pertaining to salvation are taught in so many places and so clearly that there is no doubt about them when Yeah. So on the one hand, you have people who want to insist that everything is clear in Scripture. And then on the other hand, you get some people who say nothing is clear in Scripture. And the truth is that there are things, the important things for our salvation are clear.
And the abortion, though, isn't like the top priority for God to make clear. For whatever reason, and we just don't know. Like you said, you can say like Meredith Kline did, which I have a great deal of respect for as well. And I was looking at his article, Lex Talionis and the fetus, and that's how he starts it, right? The most significant thing about legislation and biblical law, abortion, is that there is no legislation in biblical law, but he says it was unthinkable. And yet then there's that other aspect of it. But one thing I wanted to do, Tremper, if you're okay with this, I wanted to I wouldn't call it like a curveball really, but I did a lot of reflection on this, and I wanted to ask you a question based on something that you said in the chapters. You said there is, you know, when you were talking about like if we regard it as a life, then how come there are these like almost I don't know, you didn't say hypocrisies, but almost like how come we don't have funerals, or how come we don't charge people with like, you know, women who have had abortion? We don't really think about charging them with murder. And I mean, I've thought about that because I'm like, I don't want to do that. Like that doesn't feel right or seem right, even though I do take that sense like more. And even in my own thinking, like it is more, I feel like in that conception is where this life and potential of life, and it gets so weird, but I don't want to be charging people with murder that are these like poor, like women who felt like they had no other choice. Like, I mean, like you don't want to take it to those extremes. And actually my dad had a parishioner, a congregant who blew up abortion clinics in the 80s. And the FBI tapped his phone. They tapped his phone at the church, and this guy was blowing up abortion clinics. But that's you know, we don't have to get into all that. But here's one of the things I was thinking. You said, where's the theological reflection on marriage? This is from your chapter. So, do we expect to be reunited with the miscarried child in heaven? And on what theological grounds, particularly if those who argue that full personhood accrues to the zygote even before implanted on the wall of a woman's womb? And that really struck me, and I was thinking about that. And here's what I wrote. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on it because I thought about a scripture that you didn't actually mention in the book. And I wondered if you had thought about it, or if you had wrestled with it at all and then decided not to mention it. But I was like, I personally do expect to be reunited with Bethany. And Bethany, of course, is the daughter that I say, of course, but I've mentioned her before. And I think I mentioned her to you in our last conversation, that Ashley and I, my wife, lost in between our first son and then our middle child now, and our daughter. And I wrote, and when I wrote is I do expect it to be reunited. And is this in part because I was able to hold her? I was like, I'm not sure. And I think there is an aspect of that. But I expect to be reunited with her. As far as theological reflection, I would treat it the same as if I had a newborn baby that died. And I was thinking developmentally, Bethany was only 21 weeks from being full term. So 21 weeks, like developmentally, she was closer to what she would be at born than, say, you know, between her and my daughter Autumn right now, who's 2. And of course, the loss would be different between a baby that was first born and a baby that was 2. And I said, so as a text to reflect, I would reflect about David's loss of his first son to Bathsheba. And Bathsheba is, of course, for those who aren't familiar with the story listening, is a woman that King David, a mighty king of Israel, saw. He took to himself. He had sex with her, committed adultery because she was married, and then found out she was pregnant and killed her husband because he wouldn't sleep with her. It's a whole crazy story. And then actually a prophet named Nathan comes and calls David out and tells him that God is going to take his son away. That God is essentially going to kill the son that he's going to have with Bathsheba. And then when this happens, this is in 2 Samuel 12:21-23. David is fasting and he's praying and he's upset. And then he finds out that his child dies and he gets up and he like basically just starts acting normal. And his attendants ask him, why are you acting this way? While the child was alive, you fasted and wept, but now that the child is dead, you get up and eat. He answered, while the child was still alive, I fasted and wept. I thought, who knows, the Lord may be gracious to me and let the child live. But now that he is dead, why should I go on fasting? Can I bring him back? I will go to him, but he will not return to me. And I was just thinking, like, of course, that Hebrew conception of the afterlife is different, I think, than it was in Christian belief later, and maybe even what we think. But just even like, I was wondering, like, what do you think about even that verse, and this idea of like these, because of course the difference between, say, someone in the third trimester, let's say the difference in the last 10 weeks between a baby, like developmentally, is not not nearly as great as it is between the first trimester and the third trimester than between a baby that's in the third trimester and born. And I'm just wondering, like, I was wrestling with what you said and like just the theological reflection on like, what do we expect from these children that we don't know? Like, and many people lose children that are very, very young, and developmentally, they're closer to a baby in the womb than they are to their son who's maybe 10 years old or something like that. I didn't know if it's a little bit of a curveball because I know that's not something that you had said in the, in your book, but I just wanted to see, if you have any reflections on that.
Yeah. And let me begin by saying that, start by saying, I don't know for sure, but God knows, in terms of the ultimate answer to that question. Secondly, I certainly don't want to undermine the hope that you have to be reunited. And then thirdly, I would say,
Sure.
remember, we're talking about potential of life that is growing through this. So you're right to point out that this was much later in the pregnancies than, say, somebody has a miscarriage a week into the pregnancy or something like that. Or even going back to the contraception thing, that will you be united with every sperm that has become a zygote that's been implanted for 2 hours that you don't even know is happening, kind of thing. So again, I would appeal to that potential of life, and as the Jewish interpretation of Exodus 21 in the Septuagint in the first century AD does too. Until the child's fully formed, it's a different potential life and is a different type of moral violation, as reflected in the type of penalty that's attached to it. And then lastly, I will say that, as an Old Testament scholar, I didn't discuss that text because I don't read it as saying I will see this child in heaven. As you say, the concept of the afterlife is not at all developed. I think David might simply be saying, I'm going to die like he dies. and so I better get about life here. So, as most Old Testament, I'm actually much more open to glimmers of the afterlife in the Old Testament than 98% of my colleagues are. So that's
yeah, I know that.
I'm saying that we can't turn to that passage, but again, here's the thing, getting back to how you opened it. It's just the fact that my wife sadly had a miscarriage. We experienced a miscarriage at about 3 months with a pregnancy that would have been our fourth child. And it is extremely sad. It's difficult. It's, because there is that potential of life and that expectation and hope that develops. So I don't want to minimize at all the struggle of miscarriage. But it's just now so I'll just leave it there. I mean, some people will say, well, I know somebody who did have a funeral for a miscarriage, and God bless you. That's fine. I think that's not the normal customary practice. And I think sometimes that's developing because of people's pro-life views, and they don't want to be inconsistent. And I think it's unfortunate that some states are saying things like, if a woman is taking drugs and the child is harmed through taking drugs, she could be charged with murder. I mean, but I think there might be some thought to moral violation there, but really murder, I don't think so. That kind of thinking can be very abusive. Though it is the case today, if you do murder a woman and she's pregnant.
Yeah, I was going to say, Tremper,
homicide. Yeah.
Yeah, like to that point, and we're getting close to time, but I wanted to address the last point you made. It seems like Josh and I over the past several months have been asking a lot of our guests, like, what should like the church's response be on, name your specific, hot button topic of the day. And so like on abortion, like what should the church, response be with regards to that? Because I can only imagine, like, to your point, it wouldn't be a popular view, and I'm sure, like, if Josh were to come out, on the news media and say, hey, wait, like I pastor a Christian church, and I think that you guys are kind of jumping the gun here a little bit, and it wouldn't be a very popular view. So like what should the church's views be on abortion? Should it be through like legislation or persuasion or what?
Yeah, great question, and let me distance you guys from my answer.
Okay.
Which is that first of all, I think the church should stay pro-life, though I think it should also recognize the nuance of that position that we've been talking about. I also think that the church should not put its hope in legislation to address the issue, because as I see it, it's not going to answer the question. Let's say Roe versus Wade gets overturned. What's going to happen? There are going to be a number of states, last I heard, probably 30 some, that will legalize abortion on the state level. Then, let's say there's even a federal law restricting abortion, so no state can practice it, which I think is kind of a stretch, thinking that might happen. Then, besides rich women being able to go to foreign countries to get abortions, then poorer women are going to start going back to having illegal, unsafe abortions. And the abortion rate will likely not go down. The other thing to keep in mind, I was just reading about this today too, with Texas the governor of Texas is trying to withdraw Medicaid funding from Planned Parenthood because of the issue of abortion. Well, what happens then? What happens then is that Planned Parenthood can't offer the other important services that it does to poor parts of our society, including providing birth control. Only 4% of Planned Parenthood's work is in the area, is providing abortions. The other 96% has to do with helping, giving birth control, helping women stem STDs, et cetera, et cetera. What happens when women stop taking birth control? They have babies. What happens if women have babies who feel desperate that they can't keep them? Perhaps this is why the abortion rate actually goes up under Republican presidents as opposed to Democratic presidents. I don't know. The statistic is clear. The reason why isn't, but it may be that Democratic administrations do more things like providing birth control, et cetera. So this is a controversial view, but here's the deal. I think the church always can and should speak its pro-life message, regardless of what the legislation is out there. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I definitely appreciate that perspective, because it's very similar to kind of what my own perspective is, like you're not going, you can't legislate biblical, ideology, because you're going to fail, and you're going to fail miserably, and the gospel and people's lives are going to pay the price. So,
in particular,
oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, in particular, you can't legislate Christian values when the broader, larger public disagrees with that value. Now, we can all unite on things like forbidding murder, okay? I mean,
right.
or theft or something. A large majority of Christians and non-Christians agree on that. But to try to legislate values that are distinctively Christian always fail, because you're forcing non-Christians to act like Christians. And God really doesn't want us to do that as much as to encourage non-Christians to become Christians. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I totally agree. And thank you so much, Tremper, for spending some time with us. I mean, it's been absolutely fascinating to kind of hear your thoughts on it. And if any of our listeners want to, read a little bit more, I can't recommend the book, The Bible and the Ballot, enough.
Yes.
I picked it up after the first time Tremper came on board, and I haven't put it down, and for better for worse, I've used it to win arguments. So if you're into winning arguments
at cocktail parties, make sure you read this book.
It's
a really, really great book. And did you have any final words, Tremper?
Just thank you so much for the really great questions and interaction. I really loved it. Thank you both very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's an honor.
Yeah, and thank you to our listeners for listening, and we will see you guys next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.